Hello and welcome back to the Chintan Chats. And today, just ahead of the peak air pollution season, we're lucky to have Tanushree Ganguli with us. Tanushree's work is very, very well known and it's also very popular. Tanushree is the director at the AQLI, which is the Air Quality Life Index, which is at EPIC, which is the Energy Policy Institute of the University of Chicago. And what she has done by way of education is quite interesting because first she became a civil engineer and then she went to Georgia Tech in the US and retrained as an environmental engineer. And her work, which is all around data, is basically she's trying to use it to democratize data and make people more literate in a data-based way, in an evidence way, for air pollution. So thank you, Tanushree, for joining us.
Thank you, Bharti, for having me here. It's always a pleasure to chat with you about air pollution and everything else.
My pleasure today. So we're sitting in Delhi, so I can't but ask you the basic question that everyone talks about, how Delhi is one of the world's most polluted cities and India's number one polluted cities, sometimes pushed down to 2 or 3. Is this really the case or is it a data thing?
Well, so the simple answer to your question is yes. Based on the data that we have in our own database or the data that we've seen, Delhi is the most polluted city. So polluted that people here are likely to lose more than 7 years of their life. If they were to breathe cleaner air or air which the WHO, the World Health Organization, deems as safe, they could potentially gain 7 more years of life. We don't need to go to the WHO guideline. If the air quality in Delhi were improved to meet India's own standard of 40 microgram per meter cube, an individual here could live 4 years longer. So based on all the data that we have and we've seen coming in from other sources, Delhi indeed has a pollution problem. Now that's a simple answer. But if I were to give you a more nuanced answer to this question, I would say we don't know. And I know that that's not a very nuanced answer in itself, but it is the unfortunate truth. Again, going back to our database, we see that countries like Equatorial Guinea and Republic of Congo, which are among the most polluted countries, they don't have any evidence of government air quality monitoring. So whatever data that we have is satellite-based. But the ground data does not really tell us, how polluted those little hotspots could be in those countries. So there is a clear data problem, which is also defining what the pollution hotspots in the world are. The larger problem that I want to highlight here is that despite air pollution being the greatest threat to life expectancy, greatest external threat, this is very important. I think I'm going to repeat it during the conversation.
Please.
Air pollution is a greater threat today compared to tobacco, child and maternal malnutrition, HIV, AIDS, and even transport injuries. Despite that, we don't have, a comprehensive, authoritative global database on what particulate pollution levels are like across the world.
Why do you think we don't have it? Is it lack of money? Is it lack of investment? Is it lack of interest? Whose lack of interest?
So there are multiple reasons for this problem. The first is certainly lack of resources. The second is lack of prioritizing air pollution, because countries have multiple priorities, right? And perhaps there is, a perceived notion about the higher costs associated with controlling air pollution. And also, and I think this is the most important point, air pollution is always talked about in numbers, right? It could be the air quality index, it could be PM 2.5 concentration, it could be air quality life index. But the real impact of air pollution, the health impacts, we don't really have any regionally representative information on how air pollution would, let's say, affect a person in China versus in Equatorial Guinea versus India versus Japan. So given we don't have that very concrete evidence base to really justify what clean air could mean in a particular region, I think it just slips off the radar of policy priorities. And this is the problem that we, through the Air Quality Life Index or other groups like, the Health Effects Institute, which produces the State of Global Air Report, is trying to solve for, trying to make a case for the fact that air pollution is not just a hotspot problem. It's a global problem which needs global attention.
Just like temperatures are going to be unlivable, air too, could ambush us in ways you can't imagine.
Absolutely. It is already ambushing
us,
Yeah.
And so England of the 1950s, right, with its pea soup fog, is actually not so far behind in history. In fact, it's being repeated. But, 3 of 27 countries, only 3 actually of 27 Central African countries, which is a piece of data I actually got from you, only they have standards and the rest of them don't have standards. Now, that is quite frightening because of the lives that you could otherwise save by taking action. After all, a lot of resources are increasingly being focused on Africa. So why don't parts of the world, why isn't there a bigger push to help them come onto the air pollution mitigation bandwagon?
Again, I think this goes back to those two sort of problems, the data problem and the health evidence problem. I'll talk about the data problem first. I mean, if we zoom out a little bit, let's see how standards are distributed across the world. So in our database, we have 252 countries and territories. There are also a lot of sort of independent territories and acquired territories. So 252 countries and territories. 50% of those don't have standards. And unfortunately, a large part of the African continent falls within this 50% that don't have standards. And this is primarily because there is no data. What we are seeing is that within the countries that don't have standards, less than 30% have any evidence of monitoring.
Yeah, because what would you monitor for?
Worse still, less than 1% have open data. So just having data does not really solve the problem unless we're making it accessible.
Yeah, exactly.
So 30% have some evidence of data. Less than 1% don't open up the data. So a person living in those regions doesn't really know that air pollution is a problem. And then there is no demand, which then results in sort of, no standards or no sort of policy prioritization of air pollution as a problem. The second piece, the health evidence piece, 70% of all large cohort-based studies, essentially sort of looking at a group of people, seeing, how they're responding in terms of health to elevated pollution levels, 70% of such studies have happened in US, Europe, and Canada.
Wow.
70%.
Wow.
8 studies, excluding China, have happened in all of Asia. 1 study only has happened in India, which is, as we know, the second most polluted in the country of the world, second to Bangladesh. So do you see the data asymmetry that exists?
Yeah, absolutely.
How will I set a standard if I don't really know what is the level of pollution that is safe for me?
Right.
And I mean, if you see this recent report, which came out from, colleagues at Harvard and the Sustainable Futures Collaborative Group, even the standard that we deem as fit in India, the 40 microgram per meter cube standard, regions that meet that standard are still seeing sort of people with air pollution related ailments, which means that 40 microgram per meter cube that we have in India is also not safe.
Which kind of brings me to the whole thing of standards. Now, of course, there are several standards all over the world, but WHO has a standard. In India, we don't have the same standard. We have a separate standard, and it's kind of, as a manner of wording it, lower than the WHO standard, even though we're one of the few countries in the world, in the developing world, that does actually have standards. And we have a long history, right, from the early 1980s. Much stronger after 2019, really. But what's with this standard? Why is it? Why do we have these differences, and what are these differences? Can you talk about standards?
Yeah, and I think this was probably the most difficult problem that we try to solve for in this paper. The first thing that I want to say about air quality standards across the world is there is no periodically updated database of these standards. There was one report that came out in 2021 by the UNEP, and since then there has been no update. What that leaves us with is dated information on standards. Why is this a problem? Because countries typically produce standards in their own languages, which means that when we were compiling this sort of new database, which is a part of their Quality Life Index report now, we had to, constantly translate sort of from Arabic to English, and then from sort of Spanish to English, from Bangla to English, to try and make sense of what's really happening with the standards.
Yeah.
And what's happened in recent times is countries have also revised their standards, relaxed their standards, or tightened their standards based on, where they are in terms of their ability to meet their standards. So first point being sort of compiling this information of standards is a huge task in itself. And this is a gap within the global ecosystem, that there is no periodically updated repository. Now, on to your question about why are these standards very different? I think the first big reason for this is that there is no sort of baseline level understanding of pollution in most parts of the world. I think in a lot of these countries, these standards are arbitrary, or they are in line with the WHO interim targets, which have been put in place. If you see a country like Egypt, there the standard itself is 50 microgram per meter cube, which is 10 times the WHO guideline of 5 microgram per meter cube. Now, we are very curious. So we investigated this, and we found that in countries like Egypt, Morocco, Azerbaijan, where incidentally the next COP is happening, a significant pollution, particulate pollution, comes from natural sources in dust.
Yeah.
Now, how do you really distinguish between anthropogenic sources, which are very much sort of controllable by policy action, and natural sources while you're setting a standard? You can't really ignore the natural sources because, there is lack of evidence, but there will still be some kind of short-term response to elevated levels of dust in there. But what do you do about it?
Yeah.
How do you account for that in the standard? So that is the second problem. The first one being sort of limited understanding of the baseline levels. The second one being, how do you really distinguish between contribution of natural and artificial sources, right? The third one, again, limited health evidence, right? If I don't really know that what is the level up to which I breathe in my country, I would be safe. How do I set a standard? It becomes an arbitrary number without any epidemiological evidence supporting whatever standard I put in. And fourth, which I think is a little more oriented towards policy, I think if there is a standard, then countries will have to find ways to meet it, right?
Right.
So which means that you will also have to weigh in those standards in other sectoral policies that you have, which is not happening. And fifth, and this is sort of my hypothesis, we are still not looking at air pollution as a health standard, right? We are not linking air pollution standards with health goals that we set for a country. Now,
Right.
if a country is invested in increasing the life expectancy of its populace, then they should certainly have an air quality standard, because it's very clear, the evidence is clear that air quality is affecting your life expectancy. So I think sort of that combination of sectoral policy ambition, health goals, air quality goals, that sort of narrative is not being built, and essentially the reason for disparate standards that we see.
Yeah, because it's actually really frightening, isn't it? So I just want to ask you a question which people ask is, how would poor standards, because they don't change very often. When you have standards, they last for several years before they can be revised.
Yeah.
And it is really difficult for many countries to meet their own standards. And what does that mean for a child growing up in suboptimal standards?
I think, again, I will not be able to quote my data, the Equality Life Index data, to respond to this, because we look at sustained exposure to pollution, right? So we look at, if you're exposed to a certain level of pollution over your lifetime, then what will be the impact on life expectancy? But I can definitely tell you, this will have sort of impacts on the quality of life of the child growing up in that polluted region. It will result in, long-term impacts and morbidities in the child as they grow up.
So a lot of people, at least in India, have got really interested in air pollution because they're able to use these small devices, which are low-cost monitoring devices, and discover that actually even though the skies are blue on a particular day, the air is really bad. And it's not fog, it's not old-fashioned fog, it's actually really a toxic soup that's surrounding them. So what is your sense about the importance of low-cost monitoring, and what are the ways in which people should be able to start using them and, protecting themselves and advocating for cleaner air?
As you said in my introduction, I think this role that I'm in right now with the Equality Life Index is about democratizing data. And I think with consumer-grade, low-cost sensors, it's becoming easier to democratize data. But there is also sort of that caveat, right? Like how are people going to use this data to empower themselves, right? And I'd like to respond to this in 3 buckets. The first one is reducing your exposure, which is, what kind of preventive measures that you can take. Whether you want to filter for your house, which, by the way, everyone who's watching this and stays in this part of the world should have in their houses. So whether or not you can reduce your exposure. If you wear a mask while stepping on. So that's one part, right? The exposure reduction piece. The second piece is choice. And that's in your hand, right? I mean, when it is 250 outside, do you really want to go for a run? Can you avoid, going for that lunch outside in your diesel vehicle when it's 250 outside?
Absolutely.
So there is also the choice component. Would you want to switch your car ride with a metro ride, even though you know that you'll not get a seat in the metro because it's polluted outside? So it's also that choice architecture which needs to play in. And finally, accountability, right? I think the local governments are responsible for providing clean air to their constituents. We did this study back in 2020, and we found that if you look at the clean air plans that Indian cities have developed, 40% of actions in those plans, they belong to local governments, which means that local governments have a very essential role to solve for pollution, right? I mean, you probably can't get a direct connection with the state government or with the national government. You should ideally, but you can't. But at least you can hold your local governments responsible for providing the kind of air that will make you healthy. So 3 parts to your sort of 3 responses to your question: reduce exposure, choice, and accountability. Who do you hold accountable? You should know who you can hold accountable.
Yeah.
Who is responsible for managing the waste being burnt in your in your neighborhood?
Yeah.
Or who's responsible for ensuring that the construction and demolition guidelines that exist are being implemented in the construction site in your house?
Absolutely.
Who is going to be responsible for ensuring that, vehicles that you see moving around you are meeting the vehicle emission standards that they're supposed to meet? So sort of knowing these very specific problems, have an accountability angle to it, and then sort of exerting your power as a constituent to seek accountability.
So that brings me to the larger issue of airsheds. Because, we often ask our cities and we say, what's happening? Why aren't you doing this? All of that. But then there's also the issue of airsheds, because air pollution kind of circulates in a particular kind of geographical space. And so you might be sitting in Palwal outside of Delhi and breathing in pollution that comes from Delhi, because you might be in the same airshed. So are you an advocate for moving to an airshed level, knowing how poor the coordination interstate is and how it's more of a rival kind of relationship, or at least it's a tussle rather than cooperation more often than not?
I am and I'm not. I'm being very honest. This is a huge dilemma for me, even as I think through this problem.
Yeah, same here.
Because in Delhi NCR, or just Delhi, we say that 40% of the pollution comes from outside. Now, if you go to cities in Punjab, this number could be as high as 60 to 70%.
Yeah.
Right. So it is very clear. I mean, the scientific evidence that we have right now about how the interplay of sources happens is that without an airshed approach, we will only be able to solve for a part of problem. But what I also feel is that this sort of dilutes the importance of local responsibility, because there is a 50% component that you have to solve for.
Yeah.
And the larger problem here is that, there is no objective, scientific way of really measuring how actions which are being taken regionally or locally are translating into air quality improvements in a particular region. And that's what we need to move towards. I mean, if you look at the USA, I mean, they have something called the good neighbor policy. So a neighbor which is contributing to a downstream state will have to quantify how will they reduce those emissions which are going downstream. We don't have that. It will take us time to get there. But we need to get there. We need to get to that, objective mechanism of measuring and monitoring what is the local contribution, what is the regional contribution, what will the regional sources do towards mitigating their regional contribution. So I think it's not a simple answer. While sort of scientifically, yes, we need an airshed approach, but we cannot dilute local responsibility at any cost. Otherwise, we'll just keep getting ourselves stuck in that quagmire of who's polluting, you need to control, I don't need to, I'm not contributing. And that's the last thing that we want.
Absolutely. We want to take baby steps, but, mitigate all this. Which kind of brings me to the favorite North Indian question at this time of the year, which is stubble burning. And, everyone has vilified the farmer, the person who's actually growing food and tending to land and nurturing in many, many ways our very existence. Even the Supreme Court has been quite firm about this. And what do you feel? To what extent does stubble burning actually contribute to the overall pollution, at least in Delhi?
Simple answer. Stubble burning is a seasonal contributor. It contributes to Delhi's pollution for 15 out of 365 days in a year. If you look at even the Air Quality Life Index, we calculate impact of life expectancy based on sustained exposure to pollution, right? Which means that the potential gain in 7 years that a Delhiite could get as a result of breathing cleaner air is because we are looking at that year-long exposure.
Right.
It means that throughout the year, the pollution level is higher than what it should really be. It's not just 15 days. I mean, of course, because it's catastrophic during those 15 days, and that's when, it's certainly everyone wakes up to realize that, we are in a gas chamber, but we are perpetually in a gas chamber. And I think that's very important for us to understand, to sort of bunk this myth that stubble burning is the cause of air pollution in Delhi. It's not. We have an airshed. We have multiple sources, industries, vehicles, construction sites, waste burning, you name it, which contribute throughout the year. We single out stubble burning only during the catastrophic time. That's probably the only time of the year when, this whole collective consciousness, I don't think I want to call it collective consciousness, but air pollution gets into the psyche of the masses.
Yeah.
But this is what evidence tells us. 15 days is all. Beyond that, it's all the sources which exist throughout the year.
So if you had to grab the top couple of sources, maybe 3 sources, and reduce them, which ones would they be for you?
I would focus on the combustion sources, because history has told us, successful examples from neighboring countries have told us, deliberate policy action towards reducing emission from combustion sources like transport, industries and power plants is what results into improved air quality. We have industrial standards. We have to take measures to enforce them. We have vehicular emission standards, and we're trying to leapfrog from BS4 to BS6.
Yeah.
We have to enforce them. Enforcement of standards across sectors is something that should be our focus. I mean, construction dust will keep happening, right? These are dispersed sources. We don't have the kind of manpower within our urban local bodies or pollution control boards to constantly monitor. Yes, I mean, there could be a remote monitoring mechanism, which would be great, but enforcement of standards, which is the rule of the law, is something that needs dedicated effort, and that's what's going to help us improve our air quality.
Are there any good examples you've seen around industrial or anything else in India and also globally?
So interestingly, yes. I mean, for instance, if I sort of look at the example of the emission trading scheme, which is currently, underway in Surat, and it's also potentially going to get expanded to Ahmedabad. Interestingly, it was sort of a collaborative exercise between the Gujarat Pollution Control Board and researchers from University of Chicago and other universities. And there is a clear sort of case for reduction in emissions from industries without really sort of denting costs associated with emission control. So we have those case studies of innovative approaches which don't sort of impact economics of, rendering a service. So there are examples within India which definitely can be sort of replicated elsewhere or scaled elsewhere.
Oh, that's fabulous, and congratulations to EPIC, because I think you were leading that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'll close the conversation here. Thank you so much for your time and for all these, things for people to think about as they hopefully stay home instead of going out and chew on some of these little bits of knowledge that you've shared. Thank you.
Thank you, Buddy. Before closing, I want to say one thing, and
yes.
we don't think about this much, but as much as air pollution is a health problem, a sustainability problem, it is also an inequality problem. I think we need to take sort of a step back and realize how unequal air pollution is making the already unequal world that we live in. A recent data is telling us, and this is in the report, another sort of, promo towards sort of pushing you guys to read the report. We find in the report that people who live in the most polluted parts of the world, they breathe air which is 6 times more polluted than people living in the cleanest parts of the world, which means that the life expectancy of people who are in the most polluted parts of the world is shortened by 3 additional years compared to those in the cleanest parts.
Wow.
So it's not just a health problem, it's not just an economic problem or a sustainability problem anymore. It is an inequality problem which needs to be addressed through concerted global effort.
Yeah, so air pollution is definitely an inequity problem. And in fact, it's an exclusion problem.
Of course. And I think your latest study also speaks to, how it sort of excludes certain people from the discourse, which should not be the case.
And from access.
From access.
Any kind of solutions.
Yep.
Well, thank you for bringing all of this up. And great to have spoken with you, Tanushree.
Thank you so much, Bharti. This was a great conversation.
Likewise.